Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the opening night of Law Week. We're here at the Coroners Court of Victoria and the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, ready for another exciting event. Firstly, Acknowledgement of Country. We would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we sit upon, the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. We further would like to acknowledge all traditional owners of lands in which those viewing this virtual presentation and pay our respect to all elders, past, present, and emerging. So, over the last 2 years, we've given you a mock inquest, and last year, the launch of the web series Afterlife. This year, we're delving into the world of showbiz and celebrity with the inquest into the artist formerly known as Prince. Of course, we'd planned to do this live, but recent events have stymied that. But the show must go on. And here we are via Zoom with an audience of 500 people, a sellout from all around the world. Hello and welcome. It might be easier to see us in gallery view, but that's up to you guys. I'm sure you've all done your fair share of Zooming, so you probably know your way around. Now, one thing I would like to stress before we get this party started is that we are not here to apportion blame or comment on any legal ramifications of Prince's tragic death. Tonight, we are discussing a hypothetical investigation into Prince's death to illustrate the Victorian system. How would it be investigated here? What issues would be considered? And the likely outcomes. The Coroners Court is unique in Victoria's judicial system. These guys are inquisitorial, not adversarial. They're fact finders and they don't allocate blame. So please do not expect any wild accusations or revelations. Firstly, to get us in the mood and remind us what a remarkable and absolutely unique artist Prince was, we've prepared a little something very special for you. Let's have a look at this.
This is CNN Breaking News.
And CNN has now confirmed that the artist Prince is dead.
He was 57 years old
and had been struggling with illness for a while.
Police say he was found unresponsive in a lift at his home in the state of Minnesota. The cause of death is unknown.
They were making next of kin notifications. Clearly, news like this is very, very difficult to keep close to the vest.
His death has shocked and surprised fans the world over.
But more recently, we've seen the development of potent opioids or painkillers or narcotics.
Oh yes.
Such as the fentanyl group of drugs.
Yes, now these are the ones I've heard of, and I heard that they were the drugs that killed Prince.
Yes, not only Prince but a whole stack of others, about 30,000 Americans last year.
But I know it was a really challenging year of losing great artists. In 2016, we lost David Bowie, which is tragic. Then we lost Prince, and then we lost George Michael.
Look, I wasn't really a fan of Prince. I didn't know much about him. I knew a couple of his key songs, Purple Rain, but beyond that, Prince passed me by, really.
But I do remember reading about him in the media, because whenever someone dies of something of forensic interest, especially high profile, fentanyl deaths is so interesting as far as from a forensic point of view.
You know, I can't remember at all where I was when I found out that Prince died. I do remember where I was when Princess Di was killed.
I wasn't a huge fan of Prince, but like most people, I liked to party to 1999. But the first time I heard that he'd passed away was from my wife. We were at home, but my wife's a huge fan of Prince, and has been to seeing him live in concert here in, I think it was Rod Laver Arena.
An autopsy has now confirmed that he died from an overdose of a popular painkiller.
Fentanyl is 80 to 100 times stronger than morphine, 25 to 40 times more potent than heroin.
Guess I should have known the way you parked your car sideways that it wouldn't last.
My name is Dr. Dimitri Gerostamoulos. I'm the Chief Forensic Toxicologist here at the Institute of Forensic Medicine, and I oversee operations for the drug testing of deceased persons which are reported to the State Coroner, as well as a whole range of other casework that we undertake for Victoria Police.
I'm John Cain. I'm the State Coroner of Victoria. My role is to investigate deaths that occur in Victoria where there is some question about whether it was a natural death or whether it occurred in circumstances that are unusual or require some further investigation to determine the cause and circumstances of the death.
I'm Noel Woodford. I'm the Director of the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, and I'm also the Professor of Forensic Medicine at Monash University. I trained as a forensic pathologist and I still practice as a forensic pathologist, although not as often as I'd like.
The role is to determine the cause of death, the circumstances of the death, and whether there is any opportunities to, through the investigation process, identify things that should change or things that should be done differently to prevent similar deaths occurring in the future.
When we have a high-profile death, that can come in as a report by a police officer or a doctor, or often we actually get first notification of a high-profile death via the media. But a phone call might come in, and we get over 200 phone calls a day. And any one of those phone calls as you pick up, you're not sure what's going to be said on the end of the phone call. So that phone call may be a police officer reporting a death. The moment we receive information that it is a high-profile death, we still take the normal details and we still are really sure that we're respectful for the deceased, the family, and of course the law and the investigation. But at the end of that phone call, I will always contact our State Coroner and often even our director here to make sure they're aware, because we know there'll be a lot of interest in the coming hours and the coming days.
Where a death occurs in Victoria and the circumstances of the death are unusual or unexpected, that death will be referred to the coroner. And a coroner will be assigned to that case to investigate that death. The role of the coroner in those circumstances is firstly to confirm the identity of the deceased person, then to determine the cause of death, and then look at the circumstances of the death and identify any opportunities that may exist to make recommendations to avoid similar deaths occurring in the future.
Because the person's death would be unexpected, we would get the Victoria Police to investigate on our behalf. They go to the scene, they take photographs, they take statements from any witnesses that may have seen Prince or the person before they died. We'd also get statements from any GPs or medical professionals that may have seen him in the weeks or months before his death. And because he is an international artist, we would also have to negotiate with America about jurisdictional issues, but we would have jurisdiction to investigate his death here.
The next morning, I would then discuss the case with the coroner. In the meantime, when the body is admitted here, a full body CT scan will have been performed and blood will have been taken at the time of admission, assuming the death is not suspicious. Otherwise we'd wait until and have that toxicological analysis going on in a preliminary fashion, so that by the time I talk to the coroner, armed with the results of the CT scan and the preliminary toxicology and my examination of the body, I'm in a better position to advise the coroner whether or not I think an autopsy is necessary to help answer those questions that the coroner needs to answer.
We treat everybody the same. So whether they die here or as a result of coming into Australia, we have standard practices in place that detect a large range of substances, drugs and poisons. And often what we don't know is that from people who come from overseas is what drugs they may be bringing in to Australia with them. They may have medication that's prescribed in other countries that is not available here. So it becomes an issue for us in terms of detecting substances that we may not routinely look at. For example, there are certain sedatives that are available in other countries that are not available in Australia. But we have the expertise and the ability to look for those drugs in biological samples.
The coroner then will determine, based on the medical information provided by the forensic pathologist and the brief of evidence provided by the coroner's investigator, as to whether there needs to be a court hearing or an inquest to investigate and determine the circumstances that led to the death of the person.
So if we had a report of a high-profile person such as Prince, and he died here, we would still need to go through the process of ensuring that we speak to his family and explain what's happening here at the Coroners and at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine. That may mean making a phone call overseas to his own country of birth or wherever his family is and establishing who is the best person to speak to. And in this case, I believe it possibly was his sister. We would make that phone call on her time and speak to her and any other person that we need to talk to establish who is the senior next.
Has about 5% of the world's population. We use about 80% of the world's opioids. There have been 700 fentanyl-related deaths and tens of thousands more from other types of opioid overdoses.
Prince, what a remarkable artist. What an absolutely incredible artist. One of my great regrets is that I never got to see him live. I know plenty of people who saw him in a variety of settings, some of whom were lucky enough to see him in small venues where he would play after his regular show. And I imagine that some of you out there were lucky enough to attend some of those shows. He obviously loved to perform. He'd do a 2-hour show in a huge concert hall and then find a small bar to keep playing in. So let's get cracking. Before we meet the panel, I thought I'd do just a little bit of research. So we're asking everyone to be ready at your keyboards. I want to know your favourite Prince song. Now, I know you probably have a top 10 or maybe more, but for the sake of the exercise, I'd like you to please pick your all-time favourite Prince song from the options on your screen. They'll come up. There we are. You have 20 seconds to fill this in. The people may vote now. Plenty of options you see there. Purple Rain. Little Red Corvette. I'm going to out myself now and let you know that my favourite is Sign of the Times. It's the song that I danced to with my girlfriend, who later became my wife. All right. Have we got an answer? Just getting it through, and it looks like the votes are in, and with 26% of the vote, When Doves Cry. There you go. There were a few votes around here for Purple Rain, but When Doves Cry. All right, let us meet the cream, pardon the pun, of the Victorian coronial system. State Coroner John Cain, Director of the VIFM, Professor Noel Woodford, Coroner Jackie Hawkins, Chief Toxicologist Dr. Dimitri Gerostamoulos, and Head of Coronial Admissions and Inquiries Dr. Jody Ledesky. These are the experts who will guide us through what would happen if someone like Prince died here while they were on tour. What happens when someone with a high profile, like Prince, dies suddenly? We'll look at the difference between what happens here and what would happen in America. Now, of course, it can be a little bit confusing. If, like me, you used to watch Quincy when you were younger, Quincy seemed to do everything. He'd visit the scene, do the autopsy, and solve the crime. But not so here. So let's kick off with that information from State Coroner John Cain. John, do you go to the scene? Do you do the autopsy, identify the deceased, and solve the crime?
Thanks, Brian. I certainly go to the scene in certain cases, not every case. There are in Victoria, significant number, 7,000 in fact, reportable deaths. So it's not possible to go to every scene, but you do go to scenes where you're going to get real benefit out of attending there. In Victoria, ours is a court-based model, so it's different to Quincy and his colleagues in America. Their examiner model, we have coroners and courts that investigate these sort of deaths. And it is the role of the coroner to take charge of the investigation and oversee it to try and get to the cause of the death, the identity of the deceased and the circumstances. So the advantage in going to the scene is you get to see it firsthand. And there'll be an enormous amount of evidence gathered at the scene. So police will be there. They will have notified coronial inquiries and admissions, and they will have in turn rung me and said, this is a high-profile death, do you want to attend? I will have said yes. By the time I get there, the police are there, and there's a whole lot of other investigations underway. The advantage in going there is you get to see it in situ. The deceased is generally still at the location. In a case like this where there's opioids involved, and I'm told there was a lot of opioids around, suitcases of them, well, to see all that firsthand and understand that is very important. You also get the opportunity to talk to police when you get there about what they know so far. So are there any suspicious circumstances? Is there some foul play afoot somewhere? How did the drugs get there? Fentanyl is not a drug that's easy to get in Australia. So how did it get there? So by attending the scene, you get the opportunity to canvass all of those issues, talk to the police while they're there and view the scene. Because the police will take a whole series of photographs and there'll be some camera footage. There might be CCTV camera footage. There might be body-worn camera footage that you've got to piece together as part of the coronial brief. And if you've been out to the scene and had a look at it, it gives you a much better opportunity to understand what occurred and drive that investigation forward so you can get to the bottom of what occurred. So, Brian, that's what would happen here.
Thank you, John. State Coroner John Cain. So you don't do the autopsy, you work with the pathologist. So let's hear from Professor Noel Woodford, who, as well as being the director of the VIFM, is a forensic pathologist. Noel, how does your role differ from what happens in America?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Well, as the State Coroner mentioned, I'm old enough to remember Quincy, and as you say, Quincy did the lot. You know, apart from living in a boat, he went to the scene, he confirmed identity, he did the autopsy, he conducted the investigation, and he came up with the findings, and oftentimes arrested the criminals as well, I think. But here, the Institute of Forensic Medicine really is in charge of the medical and scientific elements of a death investigation, and the coroners, with whom we're very lucky to be co-located, are the legal arm of that process. So if I was the on-call pathologist and I was told about Prince's death, one of the first things I would do would be to contact the police and ask them whether they thought it was necessary for me to attend the scene. And there might be reasons, very good reasons for that, if they were concerned about the possibility of some injuries, but also whether or not they needed an opinion about the time since death. And there are certain things that we can do. It's not a very precise science, but we can do some things, including taking a temperature at the scene, which could aid in the estimation of the time since death. In any event, whatever happens at the scene, the body eventually comes into our care at the Institute in South Bank, and a number of things happen. Prince, despite his fame and his brilliance, would go through the same process as anybody else who comes into our care, and we do a number of things. We avail ourselves of any available medical history, so I, as a pathologist, am best apprised of what's been going on in this person's life, his past medical history. As far as I understand it, Prince had a couple of hip replacements, he'd had a recent flu-like illness, and of course he's just off a plane, having come from the States. So all of those things are going to be factored into my thinking. I mentioned in the grab that you saw at the start that we would do a CT scan. We scan everybody who comes into our care from head to toe, and that provides a lot of information, including negative information. So we can look at the head and say that there's no hemorrhage there in the head, there's no occult or hidden injuries. In a case where somebody's possibly taken a drug overdose, we could look at the stomach contents on the CT scan and see whether there's any dense sediment there, which can sometimes indicate that someone's taken an excess of tablets. Sometimes the CT scan can show us natural disease that we weren't otherwise aware of. And the other thing that happens around that time is we take an early blood sample, and Dimitri will talk a little bit more about this later on, but we can subject that to analysis. So very early on in the piece, the pathologist has got a lot of information because eventually the end point of this process, that triage type process, is I will be going to the coroner and recommending two things: whether or not I can offer a reasonable cause of death, and whether or not I think an autopsy is necessary. And just finally, when it comes to an autopsy, and as a pathologist, an autopsy can provide information that may be of importance to the family down the track, if not for their grieving process, but just important for understanding what were the ingredients that contributed to the death occurring at this time. So given that he'd had a history of flu, has he got an inflammation of his heart muscle? Given that he's just got off the plane, has he got a pulmonary embolus, a so-called economy class syndrome? Not that that's likely to have been the case here. And other natural disease processes. So, and we might tailor the autopsy to the things that we think are likely to be possible factors in the death. And that's a brief overview of what we would do, Brian.
Thank you, Noel. Professor Noel Woodford, as I mentioned before, as well as being director of the VIFM, is a forensic pathologist. So it is known that Prince died of an overdose. And from what we've just seen, this is particularly bad in the United States of America. Dr. Dimitri Gerostamoulos is the chief toxicologist in Victoria and an expert in all things related to drugs and poisons. Dimitri, tell us what you think happened with Prince and how things compare with America. Things are pretty bad there, is that right?
Yes, that's correct, Brian. We know that fentanyl was the primary drug that killed Prince. He had a significant amount in his blood, and not much else was found or disclosed as far as we know. But this is a drug that we would normally test, and as Noel said, we would be able to provide those results pretty quickly back to the State Coroner and also to the pathologist. So by the next morning, we'd have an idea of the primary drugs involved, if they were involved, in terms of causation to the death. We know that there are significant issues with opioid overdoses in the States. And if you look at the latest figures, and I think they're around 2017 or 2018, more than 70,000 Americans died of overdose, and about 30,000 of those are related to fentanyl. So it's a significant burden for the North American community, but we do know that they're not alone. We have seen similar increases in the UK, but in Australia we have pretty much a low mortality rate due to fentanyl. We still have deaths related to opioids, but fentanyl isn't a drug that is particularly problematic at this point in time. We know that fentanyl is here in the community. We know that there is illicit heroin, for example, that is tainted with fentanyl. And in fact, I had read in one of the reports that it's alleged that Prince actually took a counterfeit tablet of Vicodin, which is a drug called hydrocodone, which is equipotent to morphine, for example, but something like fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. So if someone is taking a drug and then they take something far more potent, they're at risk of sudden death. And that's probably what happened in the case of Prince here, Brian.
Thank you, Dimitri. Let's move on to this notion of doctor shopping that we sometimes hear about. Jackie, it'd be good to talk about how doctor shopping isn't just reserved for celebrities, but happens with all people, all walks of life, and it's happening here in Victoria. What does it mean and what are the dangers?
Yes, thanks, Brian. Doctor shopping is a big problem in Victoria. It basically means when a person goes to a number of doctors seeking different prescription medications. In Victoria, there are approximately 700 of these overdose deaths a year from prescription medications. And over the last 10 years, coroners have identified this as a pretty big issue and have made a number of recommendations requesting that the government introduce something like a real-time prescription monitoring system. It's taken a long time, but in April this year in Victoria, the system has been implemented and it's called Safe Script, which basically means that it's now mandatory for a doctor who is prescribing medication and a chemist who is dispensing the medication that they have to log on to this Safe Script system. They can, with the Medicare card of a patient, they can see the recent medications and prescriptions that that person has obtained or being prescribed, and can actually refuse to give that medication to the patient if they need to. This is a great example of the prevention role of our court. So when we can identify an issue and then actually implement recommendations or suggest recommendations that then become implemented into policy, it's fantastic. Now, as this is a hypothetical situation, I'm not saying at all that this is how Prince obtained his fentanyl. We don't know in this case. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Jackie. What about, let's look at what would happen here. Dr. Jody Leditsky is in charge of the mortuary here in Victoria and the manager of coronial admissions and inquiries. Jody, you'd get the first call, wouldn't you? And would it make a difference if that person is from overseas?
Yes, Brian, you're right. The Office of the Coronial Admissions and Inquiries does get the first phone call. So a number of nurses and special executive assistants sit there and they answer the phone all day. You never know who is on the end of that phone. So in this case, we probably would have got a phone call from a police officer. He would have rang, and to start off with, we ask, why are you ringing? Why is this death reportable? And he may say, I've got an unknown, a person, deceased, at home that has died suddenly. We immediately go to some quick questions, including the name, date of birth. At that point of time with Prince, I'm sure that we would have recognised who it would be. And immediately you start to think, oh, this is going to be a lot of news and a lot of information, a lot of questions. But you also immediately go into the professional mode. That, as many people have already said on this panel, everyone is treated the same, with the same respect. So I would ask questions such as, okay, is there any drug paraphernalia around? Was there potential, anything there that, any injuries that the coroner and the pathologist, Noel, may ask me shortly after this phone call? Was there a suicide note? Unfortunately, it's a standard question we often have to ask. So once we get those basic details, I would then ask that, is the deceased ready to be moved? And practical information such as how easy is it to move the deceased? So that would be arranged, and then he would be admitted to the mortuary by the mortuary staff, the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine. So then, as Noel said, then we'd be gathering lots of information. All that information would be gathered to put to the pathologist, and then the pathologist and the coroner would meet to discuss. Now, throughout this process, the one key thing that's in their mind, particularly of the Coronial Admissions Inquiries Office, is actually speaking to the family and speaking to the right family, which is so important. It's very clearly defined in our Act who we should be speaking to. Now, I think in the grab I said that possibly he had a sister, Prince had a sister. But since then I've read a little bit, and he's also may have a father. Now, that's important information for us, because the father would be the senior next of kin. So that is the person that we would need to actually give a call to. So people may be ringing us for information, wanting information, and we'd have to explain we really do need to find the right person to speak to. And that's really just important for us so the right people get the right information. So eventually, maybe we speak to the father and maybe we do speak to the sister. Now, they're calls made by nurses in our office, and they can be quite difficult sometimes. But we do make that call, and it's really important that we make that call within 24 hours. So we'd make the call, would speak to the family member, and then would go through the different process. We would ask what are their wishes in regards to an autopsy, because depending on the circumstances and whether it has been determined that the coroner would like an immediate autopsy, The coroner will always take into account, will often take into account the wishes, and we get that information to be able to provide to the pathologist and the coroner that information. After all of this, and after all the process you've heard about, we would also then be discussing with the family about the repatriation of the body and the funeral process. And you're right, when someone is from overseas, we then also have a lot of gathering information. We may be talking to the US Embassy, for example. We may get phone calls, and how best we can assist the family in doing the most appropriate burial possible. And throughout all of this and overarching this is a reminder and the very important things amongst all our staff about confidentiality and about ensuring that that information is kept very much with the people that we know. And with, as you know, with someone in high profile, it's really, really important for us and for all the staff to maintain the respect of that. So that's really the operational part of it, Brian, which would happen if Prince died here.
Thank you, Jodie. And I think one of the crucial points that you make there is that all cases are treated absolutely equally, whether they are celebrity or whether they are just like you or I. We want to thank all the viewers who let us know that Prince's father has in fact passed away, and sometime in the 90s, I think. So, at the end of the day, what do you all feel about Prince and his death? How likely would it be to happen here? So what I'd like to do, I'm going to ask each of you to just give us your impressions, your thoughts, your feelings about these two issues. How do you feel about Prince and his death, and how likely would it be to happen here? Let's start with you, John.
Thanks, Brian. Well, it's a tragic death when somebody dies from an overdose of drugs. And I think the critical thing from the coroner's point of view is that we've established the identity through Jodie's team working with the family, and the body's been repatriated, and we have a cause of death because of the good work that Noel and his team have done, whether it's just by examination of the body or whether it's through autopsy. So that really leaves it for the coroner to try and provide answers to the family, and in Prince's case, the fans, who will have lots and lots of questions about how this happened and why. And our role is to really make sure that we conduct a thorough investigation and, if necessary, run a court hearing, run an inquest to provide answers to the family and the fans about this tragic death, with a view to giving them, I guess, some comfort and closure arising from such tragic circumstances. So I think, Brian, that's the important next step as far as the coroner's concerned.
Thank you, John. What about you, Jackie?
I think after a thorough investigation has occurred, whether that is through looking at the coronial brief or having an inquest and calling witnesses, the next important thing that we must do as coroners is look for any prevention opportunities. And if through the circumstances of this case, things became apparent, we were aware of where the medication came from or how it was being brought into the country, we would certainly make recommendations that could prevent any death like this occurring in the future. That's our main goal after we've done the identity, cause of death and the circumstances. It's really about preventing these kind of deaths in Victoria.
Noel, let's hear from you.
Well, I think it's really important to remember that, you know, despite his fame and his brilliance, that this is a human being who's got friends and family who rely on this system here to get it right. The other thing I'd say is that, mercifully, we haven't seen the sort of tidal wave of fentanyl deaths that they have in the States, but that doesn't mean we don't see the tragic number of opiate overdoses. Here it just happens to be heroin. So I think that, it's important to realise that here's this threat that might come here from fentanyl, but we've got our own problem as well in the meantime, which is heroin deaths.
I'm just going to jump in here and I imagine other people are wondering too, why is it that we don't have the incidence of fentanyl deaths in Australia?
I don't know. This might be a question for Dimitri.
Yes.
Perhaps it's just, we have different medical prescribing habits, so it's just not as much of it around that gets diverted potentially. Maybe people have a taste for heroin and not for other opiates. I'm not quite sure.
Let's throw that to Dimitri and also get your wrap up.
So in answer to that question, we have, like the US, a large opioid dependent population, but there are different triggers. And we also know that the importation of drugs through places like Mexico, China, it's a huge market in the US, and the explosion of fentanyl and fentanyl type drugs is a real issue in the States. We don't have a lot of fentanyl in Australia. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a low fentanyl mortality rate. However, we do still see a number of deaths related to the illicit use of opioids such as oxycodone. The other thing I want to point out, Brian, is that in the US, Vicodin, which is exclusively consumed pretty much by the United States, about 95% of the world's supply is consumed in the US. We don't have that issue here or in other countries. The other thing that we would do in our coronial system is also have the ability to analyse hair as an additional sample. Now, this would give us some additional information about whether Prince had previously taken fentanyl. My understanding is that he was on hydrocodone for some time, and that the fentanyl, being a far more potent drug, led to his death. We would have that information, and as part of our normal processes, we'd be able to establish whether he'd had this drug in the past. So there are some differences between us and North America.
Thank you, Dimitri. And Jodie, I would hate you to think that I'd forgotten you.
Well, I won't answer the question about incidents because the experts on the panel have answered that. But,
yep.
You know, any sudden death is incredibly sad, and speaking to the families every single day of sudden death, you just realise how many people are affected. And the death of a famous person, you know, reaches out to so many people, but it has got us talking about fentanyl and the dangers and everything, and hopefully something will good come out of that, or people will question about it. So, and that thing that I think that's important.
Thank you, Jodie. All right, just to wrap up, ladies and gentlemen, in true Q&A style, we've had some questions that have come in from our audience. So let's go to a few of them. First off, we should say we're very excited that we have taking part in this broadcast, watching Charles Smith. Now, Charles is Prince's cousin. He's joining us in the audience tonight. He's watching from Minneapolis, Minnesota, with his wife. Thank you to you both. Charles has sent in a question, so let's kick off with that one. Charles is wondering if in the Victorian model, if people can refuse to give evidence or witness statements to the coroner. And I think we should go to John for that.
Very clear that coroners, Jackie and I and any one of the other 9 coroners in this state, can compel somebody to come to court and give evidence. And there are only a very limited range of reasons why they might be able to refuse that. And the main one of those reasons is if in giving the evidence and answering the questions truthfully, they may tend to incriminate themselves. So in the hypothetical we're looking at tonight, if the police in the course of their investigations identified one of Prince's entourage who had brought a big bag full of fentanyl into the country and was possibly going to charge that person, or alternatively another of the entourage had given the drugs, the fentanyl, to Prince to take, and there was some question about whether there might be a criminal charge arising from that, then that person could come to court and say, no, I'm not prepared to give or answer the questions in relation to those matters because it may incriminate me and I don't want to do that. And a coroner can excuse them in those circumstances from giving the evidence. But otherwise, the investigation power of the coroner is to get to the bottom of what happened and find out as much information as they can, and therefore that power to compel witnesses to attend and give evidence is a very important part of the investigation process. So the short answer is, Brian, can be compelled, but there are some excuses in particular circumstances.
Thank you, John. Now, we also welcome Ivana Charlton, who's in our audience. Ivana asks, where does the coroner's duty end in the process? Can the coroner refer a death to criminal proceedings? And we ask our coroner, Jackie Hawkins.
Thanks for the question, Ivana. Our court is inquisitorial, so we are seeking the truth or a version of the truth. But in Victoria, a coroner is not permitted to make a finding or a comment about someone, whether they're guilty of an offence. We can, however, refer a case to the Director of Public Prosecutions if we believe that an indictable offence may have been committed in connection with the death. And if that was the case, as soon as we become aware that we think there might be a criminal case, so if we find out that the entourage has brought in some fentanyl tablets in the case of Prince, we would probably step back, refer it to the Director of Public Prosecutions, let them go ahead with the criminal prosecution first, because the criminal prosecution is probably important in terms of their criminal liability for that to occur first. The standard of proof is beyond reasonable doubt, so they have a higher standard of proof. Our standard of proof is on the balance of probabilities. So once the criminal process had occurred, it would come back to us and we would finish our investigation and make a finding.
Thank you, Jackie. We have a question now from P. Parker. How much fentanyl was found in the bloodstream, in Prince's bloodstream, according to autopsy results? I think we'll go to Dimitri for this.
A lot. It's not insignificant. So my understanding is that Prince had a concentration of around 70 nanograms per mil. Typically what we see in overdose deaths are related to fentanyl, that they're less than 5. Particularly here in Australia, we don't have a high incidence of fentanyl-related fatalities. But in the States, that might be normal for someone who's taking, counterfeited or illicit fentanyl.
Mm-hmm. From David from Warrandyte, in the case of a death like this, would you do a full autopsy? Noel?
Well, the short answer is not necessarily. Jodie mentioned before that one of the things that happens in that early phase is that we would engage with the next of kin and seek their views on autopsy. Should I have recommended one to the coroner? They may not particularly want an autopsy to go ahead for religious or aesthetic or cultural reasons, and that's considered in the decision-making process. I think here the pathologist really is a synthesizer of information. So there's the results of the CT scan, there's the preliminary toxicology results, there's the external examination results. And what's really important to remember is that we've only got Prince's body for a very short period of time. And in that period of time, we've got to try and anticipate the needs of a number of different legitimately interested parties. And in Prince's case, a much broader sweep of people who were his fans. So we don't want to get that wrong. And so we've got to make decisions. And it might well be that having heard the views of the family, I might go to the coroner and say, well, it looks very much like a fentanyl-related death. But given the fact that he's a 57-year-old male, given the fact that he's recently been unwell, we might need to think about excluding the possible contribution of these other processes to the death. And so I would advise the coroner of that. And it might well be that we just need to confine the examination to the chest and maybe even look at what's in the stomach. If there's a suggestion that there's been too much fentanyl taken or ingested in the form of tablets, we would look at the stomach contents and see just how much there was there. And that might give us an idea about intent, for instance, if there's an excessive amount of tablets sitting in the stomach.
Thank you, Noel. Deb Harvey asks, and I think we'll throw this one to you, Jodie, if the death is unexpected, are fingerprints normally taken?
So fingerprints aren't normally taken, but they are taken in circumstances where we need it to assist with identification. Part of the role of the coroner is determine identification, and we can do that a number of the ways. For example, someone that may have known Prince may have been there at the scene and they will complete a statement of identification. But there are many circumstances where we cannot do a visual identification, so we need to do it by scientific means. We've got a range of experts here at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine that work in this field, that assist the dentists, and also DNA possibility. But the question was about fingerprints. So in this case, if the police requested it as part of the investigation, required fingerprints as part of the crime, the scene, not necessarily a crime, but the scene examination, yes, then he may have been fingerprinted, but not everyone is fingerprinted that comes here.
Thank you, Jody. We've got one back to, we'll go to Dimitri, I think. How do we track doctors' prescriptions here in Australia?
That's not easy to do. So I think Jackie mentioned before the introduction of SafeScript here in Victoria, which will allow practitioners who prescribe drugs to monitor what prescriptions people are receiving. But doctor shopping has been a significant problem in Australia for many years. My understanding is that some states have some regulatory mechanism in place to be able to monitor those prescriptions, but it is still difficult to try and determine what drugs and how many of these drugs people are taking in combination. Let's not forget, often people who take opioids or painkillers will also be taking other drugs such as benzodiazepines. And these drugs also have additional sedative effects. So in combination with other recreational or prescribed drugs, they can often lead to toxicity and to death. And in fact, prescription drugs are more common here in Victoria than illicit drug deaths.
One for Noel. Noel, from Anna. The autopsy only took 4 hours. Would that be right?
Yes, I guess so. It depends. I mean, it depends on what you mean by an autopsy. An autopsy, in my mind, is a number of different processes, one of which might be the internal examination of the body. So there's a very careful external examination. There's synthesis of the findings, both on external and internal examination, with medical history, the results of toxicology, whether any microbiology is performed. 4 hours is a longish time for an autopsy, just in terms of the external and internal examinations. I don't really know whether there are any injuries that cause people concern in this case, but I'm not surprised to hear it took 4 hours, but it is a long time.
One for you, John. How tight are the media restrictions in Australia as opposed to America? I suppose it's John in Elsternwick. John wants to know the influence or the interference, perhaps, of the media in a case like this.
Well, I think, Brian, what we would try and do is ensure that the media influence and, I guess, the hysterics that often go with the tragic death of a high-profile person don't interfere with the investigation. So in the early stages, police would need to ensure that the media scrum didn't interfere with what was happening at the scene, that was all protected and preserved, and that the information that came out or was available about the death was held closely so as not to interfere with the investigation, and also being at all times very respectful of the family and their interest in it, because it's an unsatisfactory situation where family are learning things from media reports. In the court process, though, we do have open courts, and media can, of course, attend and they can report on things here. But it's really the reporting of the court process that is the legitimate and appropriate way to tell the story, rather than tidbits of leaked information being put out on the front page of tabloid newspapers day after day, and people chasing others down the street to try and get some information or comment from somebody involved. I think inevitably there would be significant, probably worldwide attention on this story, but as a coroner, we would be trying to ensure that none of that media interest and attention in any way prejudiced the investigation that we're undertaking.
And have you found that difficult in your time, in your role, to sort of separate the media from the job that you have to do?
I think all courts face that problem from time to time. We've seen in recent times the trial of George and appeals of George Pell, which were significant in Victoria, and I guess that was the high watermark of media interest. It's very important that the court asserts its control and authority over the process to ensure that the investigation in a coronial matter or in a criminal matter, that a fair trial and a fair process is available to people, so that there can't be claims that the investigation into the circumstances of death was in any way prejudiced by media attention.
Thank you, John. One for Dimitri from Aaron in Canberra. Dimitri, would it be possible to consume this amount of fentanyl in a self-administered dose?
Yes, so I've already answered that in the chat actually, Brian. So if you have a tablet that contains a high amount of fentanyl, it is quite possibly that you get such a concentration. But something that our viewers may not be privy to is that when someone dies, there are changes that occur within the body. And often, but not always the case, we see increases in drug concentrations, which may not necessarily be reflective of the drug concentration at the time of death. So we know for a good many drugs that these concentrations often go up. So it is possible that with fentanyl you have some mechanism of redistribution which leads to an increase of drug after death. But to go back to the essence of the question, yes, it is possible if you've got a substantial amount of fentanyl in a counterfeit pill.
And finally, we've got time for one more question from Barbara in Gosford. Back to you, Noel. And I suppose in a way, this is the million-dollar question. How do you determine whether such a death was an accident, was murder, or was a suicide?
Well, I think the short answer to that is that sometimes the findings from a pathology perspective can be entirely the same. And I mentioned the word intent before. That's something that is looked at as part of the investigation, and there's a number of different parallel investigations going on. The police are looking into issues, as is the coroner, and I'm supplying the medical and scientific expertise and investigations into that process. But in this jurisdiction, it's the role of the coroner to determine what the question is really referring to as the manner of death. So whether homicide, suicide, accident, natural or unascertained. And that is something that in the US system, the medical examiner does, but here, that's a legal determination at the end of a process.
Thank you very much, Noel. Very circumspect, like all of you. And we want to thank you all. We do have to wind things up and leave it there. Another fascinating Law Week event from the forensic and the legal folk here at the Coronial Services Centre. I want to thank you all our participants tonight, John, Jackie, Dimitri, Noel and Jody. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. Also like to thank Lynn, Mick, Lisa and everyone else at the Law Foundation for another great program and for inviting us to be part of the fun. We'll see you all next year, hopefully in the flesh. Good night and goodbye.